Let's talk about everyone's favorite thing, kind of why most of us got into filmmaking, and that's because at some point in our life we held a camera up to our eye and thought, wow, this is magical, I want to do this more often. And now look at you, you're trying to get paid for it, maybe you're getting paid for it, maybe you've been getting paid for it. We should all feel very lucky that we've discovered cinematography, filmmaking, photography, whatever it is that you're passionate about, because it's a joy and it doesn't feel like work. And when it does feel like work, it might be because we're doing something wrong, or, well, actually sometimes filmmaking is work. It's a lot of work. What am I talking about? There's a lot of work to get to brief moments of euphoria in filmmaking. But I'm not here to talk about that. Let's talk about cameras. What do I recommend you look for in a camera? I want to first preface this by, I said recently in a video online that I'm camera agnostic, and I am. I believe every camera company out there has amazing cameras, and there's no one right camera. People are like, why did you choose the A7 III? Well, I owned an FS7 at the time when I bought this, and I wanted my cameras to match. That's really all it was it would be easier to color correct and post. There was cameras better than that. At that time, the 1DX was better than this. There was other cameras. Now there's the Canon R5 out. It's way better than this in some ways, maybe not in all ways, probably most ways. But I don't really get too caught up in cameras because it's really what's in your hand, and that's the most important thing. What camera do you have access to? Because if you have access to a camera, you should start using it, because anytime you film with a camera, you're going to be learning more about your style, you're going to be growing as a filmmaker, and you're going to be opening up doors or opportunities to discover a new film. So I want to get that out of the way to say that these tips and tricks I'm giving you, there's not really any tricks, just these tips for finding a good camera or what you should be looking for in a camera. They're principles, and don't let me tell you what camera to buy. This is kind of the guidelines that I use when I'm purchasing a camera. So that was the longest preamble for me to give you these tips, and let's talk about them. Before I even get into the specifics, the number one thing is, can you shoot all day with this camera that you're looking to buy? Have you tested it, and do you feel comfortable holding it all day? Are your shots just as good in the morning as they are in the evening? The only way to know that is to go out and try it. Buying a camera without ever having tried it, or just a little bit, it's a bit of a risk. I bought a GH4 years ago without ever having tried it, and I ended up hating the camera. There was many things about it I didn't like. I think Panasonic makes great cameras, but the GH4 wasn't right for me, and I ended up selling it pretty soon after I bought it. So can you work with the camera all day, and does it feel right for you? The number two thing I would say is, does it break your clips up into shorter segments? If you're filming a documentary, there's a good chance you're gonna be filming interviews. There's a good chance your interview is gonna be longer than half an hour. Having cameras that break up clips into half an hour segments, if it can be avoided, is ideal for many reasons. Having clips break up in the middle of recording, you can often not realize this, and you miss opportunities for good moments in your interviews. It causes chaos in the edit when trying to sync multiple camera angles. Try to avoid cameras if you're going into documentary that break your clips into half an hour sequences. Highly, highly recommend getting cameras that can continuously record. I only really record interviews on my FX9, which is what I'm recording this right now. So I tend to go for cinema cameras because they can do long record, as long as you want, they'll keep recording, as long as you have media. And if you're not sure about camera work, if you're going into a project and you don't know, bring someone along who knows more about cameras than you. My creative partner, Michael Del Monte, he didn't know cameras, although now he's one of the best cinematographers I know in the documentary world. He'd shot his whole film. His name is Ray. It's beautiful. It's insane. Michael's very, very talented. But when he did his film Transcend, he didn't really know camera work, so he brought along a bunch of people who were experienced cinematographers to help shoot it. And this is what you can do. You can solicit, if you have a good treatment, I'm talking about treatments in this course, you bring that to a cinematographer, you get them inspired by the images you're pulling from the internet. You might be able to get a really great cameraman to work with you who believes in your vision, and this is a great thing to do. I, to this day, will hire cinematographers on all of my commercials I work on, or most of them, because I believe I would rather have someone completely focused on the images on the film so that I, as a director, can focus on the story. But getting back to cameras, I'm going to talk about the pro list, kind of like what you should be looking for in a prosumer or a professional camera, and then if you need to get a mirrorless, what you want to look for in that. I don't recommend these cameras for documentaries, but if you have to, we'll talk about that. But first off, looking in kind of like the pro tier, the prosumer level, you want to look for XLR. You need XLR inputs for audio. You don't need them, but they pretty much do. They're very helpful. They solve a lot of problems with grounding, and I don't need to get onto the technical specs, but get XLR inputs. It's much easier to connect audio interface, especially when working with a professional sound guy. You want XLR. Number two, and this is really overlooked, is timecode. Does your camera have a timecode input? The FS7 didn't have timecode unless you added the giant XDCA adapter, which was useless because of how big it was just to get timecode. But make sure your camera has timecode. The FX9 now has timecode in, which is great. It's really helpful. Timecode allows you to sync your audio and your camera, and it saves you hours in post-production. Especially when you can sync multiple cameras together, you can just right-click in Adobe Premiere and say sync, and it saves you so much time. Timecode is really important. So XLR, timecode. The next thing that I'm looking for when buying a camera is dynamic range. This would probably be the most important thing across the board for me with a camera, is its color science and its dynamic range, because this is ultimately the factors that next to your lighting impact the final image of what the audience is going to see. And dynamic range is the difference between your shadows and your highlights. How many stops of light can you expose in that range? And so to a lot of manufacturers, like for the new Sony A7 III, AS7 III, they're claiming 15 stops of dynamic range. That's usually in a lab. It doesn't always look that way in real life. 12 stops is kind of the minimum, but that's kind of like a good amount of stops, I would say. But look for good dynamic range, because this is going to help you be able to expose skies or bring back information in a really bright window. And in documentary, you don't always have control of all the lighting that you're walking into. It's really important that you can bring back information in the sky, because when you just have these white blown out skies like mirrorless cameras often shoot right around the sun, it gets all white and blown out. It just looks unprofessional. It's kind of distracting. And for me, if you can expose that, it makes your images and makes your film look premium and makes it look, quote, cinematic. Another thing to look for is sensor size. You want to know if you have the right lenses for your sensor. And so if you have camera lenses that are only for crop sensor or APS-C, it's not going to work on full frame. So this camera is full frame. This is the A7 III. So you want to, I ended up going with this camera because all my lenses, because I owned a 5D before, worked on full frame. My FX9 is also full frame. I love full frame because I like to crop my films in 2:3:5 or 2:1. And when you have a full frame sensor, you're able to put wider lenses on your camera and you get shallower depth of field, which on wider shots. And I like wide shots. I find wide shots very cinematic, showing the entire world. So this is when I want to go for full frame. But you may not care about this. I typically avoid 2/3 inch sensors or 4/3 inch sensors, but by all means, I try to avoid them. S35 is the smallest sensor that I will personally use. This next piece of the camera is not really the camera. It's an additional thing that you can buy, which is a camera cage. I don't have a camera cage on here, but getting a camera cage, it's one of those little aluminum things that goes around the camera, and you can add pieces of equipment to it. What's great about those is they reinforce the camera body, and they allow you to add a hot shoe onto it. Adding a top handle to your camera is the #1 piece of gear you want as a documentary filmmaker, something to hold your camera all day. You don't want to be filming like this. That's 2 places that you're going to shake and move your camera around, or when you're holding a top handle, it makes your images much more stable, and I think you can get much easier dynamic shots when you have a top handle. So buy a camera cage, build up your camera body a bit so that it's not just the plastic that it came in. Another thing that I'm looking for when I'm buying a pro camera is the weight. I want it to be heavy, but I don't want it to be too heavy. 10 pounds is kind of the max weight that I go for with cameras. The FX9 body is just under 5 pounds, but once I add all my camera gear to it, the lens, the battery, the matte box, the monitor, it's just above 10 pounds, but 10 pounds is kind of an ideal weight for me to go all day. Also, in that 10-pound range is when the camera doesn't jitter like a mirrorless, and so you don't get all these shaky shots. You get some shots that have some, not vibration, but some movement, some wobble to them. but it's not a jitter like you get with smaller cameras. So I like my camera to be a bit heavier. The last two things I would look for in a camera is its file size. Is the files coming off this camera manageable? People are so excited about the 12K Blackmagic camera, but who has enough hard drives for that? Even the new R5, when you shoot 8K, not even 8K raw, just the 8K files, they're so big. I went out with my friend Mati and we shot on the R5 recently, and like just in a matter of moments, we had like 600 gigs of footage just from like filming for an hour. And I would blow through hard drives that way. So for me, manageable file sizes is really important for documentary. The FX9 has a great XABC file size, the 422. I think it's one of the best codecs for documentary. It's not as big or as intensive for your computer as something like a RAW file, and it really saves on hard drive space, which is really helpful over a long period of time. And the last thing is slow motion. Does your camera have slow motion? It's really helpful in a documentary to have some moments where you can shoot slow motion, especially if you don't have much time with your character or you're shooting a shorter documentary. Having those moments of slow motion is important. So if your camera can shoot 4K 60, this is a bonus. Talking about intro cameras, more inexpensive cameras, let's call them, one of the most important things is, can your camera record log? Does it have a log color space? This isn't RAW, but this is a very flat profile, and log allows you a lot of flexibility in post. You do have to inject a lot of color back into the log, which it does have in that information. Log always looks really faded and looks desaturated, but all the color information is there. The Sony log space, I know I can pump it full of like 200% saturation before it starts looking crazy, but this is just that nature of the S-Log3. But can your camera record log? Does your camera have good dynamic range? And if it does, then you want to look at the codec it's shooting on. A lot of mirrorless cameras now have the ability to shoot 422. I won't get into all the reasons why 422 is good. It's just better than 420, which is what a lot of cameras shoot. Like this camera here is shooting a 420. Not ideal for color correction, but if you can get a camera that shoots 422 internally, you're really helping your color grade. You're not going to regret it. Your images are going to look much stronger and sturdier when you get into post-production. There won't be as much noise and they won't fall apart when you start color correcting them. Another thing to look for is, does it have stereo in? Can you get a stereo mic input into that, not just mono? The next thing you want to look at is your lens mount. Do you have lenses that can mount for this? Is it really obscure? Again, the 4/3, it gets you into a lot of adapters. There's not many micro 4/3 lenses out there. I like the Sony adapter. Canon is probably the most versatile to me because most people have some sort of Canon lens, or there's always EF adapters. Sony E-mount is actually pretty easy to find. Right here on this camera, I have a vintage 50mm lens on it, so I have this. That's in the shadows there. I have this K&F Concept adapter for old PK lenses, and I got this adapter for I think like 20 bucks on Amazon. But that's the great thing, is when you get cameras like the Sony or the Canon, you can buy adapters really quickly online anywhere you want. The next thing you should be looking for when you're buying like a mirrorless is, does it have a high bit rate output over the HDMI? Can you record a better file size? Because sometimes if you need to bring this onto a professional set, or you have a project where there's a bit more of a budget, having that high bit 422 output off of the HDMI 10-bit is really helpful. Look for that, because there's sometimes if you put a Shogun or some sort of external recorder, you can get much better images off that camera than if you were recording internally. So that was a long talk about what I believe are the things you're looking for when buying a camera. I'm not talking about all other sorts of fancy things, 120 frames, all that stuff's fun, it's bonus. These points that I'm making right now, I'll probably would have made them 3 years ago, and I probably will make them 5 years from now, because they're kind of the standard things. Yeah, there's autofocus, there's all sorts of great things. You can look for those, but I think if you're good at manual focus, then you never have to worry if your camera has good autofocus or not, because you're going to be better than your camera, hopefully, although the cameras are getting pretty impressive. I'm using autofocus right now. See how well it works in the dark. Oh yeah, still, look at that, it's still grabbing me. But anyways, there's your camera tips. I wanted to get in depth. You guys are in this course, so I'm giving you way more information than our friends on YouTube get with me. We're getting to talk longer and more in depth. I'm trying to give you guys as much information as possible, but leave me a comment. Let me know what more you want to know about cameras. I'll see you guys in the next video in the Art of Documentary.